If I could have your attention, I think it is time we start. There will be a few more people maybe drift in. Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, wherever it happens, whichever time it happens to be, wherever you are, and welcome to this webinar series hosted by InfUr, the Informal Urbanism Research Hub at the University of Melbourne. My name is Kim Dovey and I'm Director of the Hub. And while we are from many parts of this wonderful planet, I want to acknowledge, first of all, the traditional owners of the particular place where this event is hosted, the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation. This land was invaded in the early 19th century and was never ceded. So this is the first in a series of webinars under the broad heading of the paradox of informal urbanism, which we have framed to engage with or to move beyond the paradox that informal urbanism is deeply implicated in globally in unequal practices and precarious livelihoods, yet at the same time represents a form of radical democracy that embodies the right to the city. Now, I'm not going to launch into any kind of theory lecture, but this is the idea that informal urbanism paradoxically seems to work with and against the formal structures of the state. Today, it is my great pleasure to introduce AbdouMaliq Simone, who is Senior Professorial Fellow at the Urban Institute at the University of Sheffield. I can't easily or quickly summarize his work. I'm sure most of you know it, but I will say that he is an ethnographer of urban informality par excellence, meshing the best of urban theory with the most insightful of fieldwork. I have learnt so much from his books, which include City Life from Jakarta to Dakar, Jakarta, Drawing the City Near, and the more recent New Urban Worlds. We will have time at the end of Maliq's talk for some discussion, and I'd ask you, if you have a question on the way through, if you would log your question simply by registering on the chat that you have a question. There's no need to write the question out. And I will trawl through them in the order in which they're registered. So in the meantime, please keep your microphones muted at all times unless you are speaking. So for now, it's my great pleasure to introduce AbdouMaliq Simone.
Thank you, Kim. Thanks for this opportunity. Particularly because I feel a great affinity with the hub. I feel it's a kind of a spiritual home. And so I always appreciate this chance to join with you. And I'm particularly happy because one of the members of the hub now is come to be a member of the place where I work. So I also feel an even stronger connection. So I'm welcoming Tanzil to the University of Sheffield. What I'm going to try to do today is to think about these notions of paradox, not strictly in the terms of the formal and informal, but rather to bring some kind of different angle to the consideration by thinking through some elements of Black studies that might shed a particular kind of perspective on this notion of paradox. The presentation is quite abstract, so what I've done is the slides are fairly text heavy, but hopefully that will enable make it easier to try to follow what I'm going to say. So the title is in Differences Without Separability, and some notes on the paradoxes of Blackness and some of the ways racial capitalism underpins the urban modern. So if the slides aren't advancing, just let me know. So cities have long been characterized by and considered through their differences. So regardless of the particular political reality of any city, there has to be a way for these differences to exist, at least partially, without differentials of force or value. In order to keep pace with the volatility of their continuous recombinant associations, nothing can become too indebted, nothing can become too dependent upon specific characteristics or composed relations. And yet, of course, there are orders of things, and things can only be really understood, comprehended through being held in place, kept in some kind of line. But as Gilbert Simondon points out, we don't know what can give rise to the effective connection of different kinds of elements, what we can call a being collective, as whatever this collective or construction is necessarily leads to the emergence of something that can't be reduced to its elements or any totality. So what the Black juridical theorist Denise Ferreira da Silva emphasizes are the ways in which difference has been mobilized to constitute regimes of separability. And importantly, what she points to is the mode of calculation that institutes liberty as entwined with property. The protection of citizenship was to be secured through the availing of both land and self to the terms of property. Because property was always something in need of development. It wasn't simply about possessing land, but property, that property needed development, was always in need of being attached to measures of productivity. And this productivity was anchored in the requirement for the taming of the land, the imposition of disciplinary maneuvers exerted by the position of the owner. So the imbrication of this form of property on the body of Blackness made then Blackness available to the coercive force of possession required to impose a specific disposition on both body and land, to detach it from its organicity and ecology. So in this sense, the turning of Blackness, the Black body into property, then made it, availed it to being the recipient of a coercive force. And that coercive force was necessary to turn that body into a locus of development, and to detach it from any sense of its genealogy, any sense of its sort of ecological relationships. But freedom, liberty, then was seen as the exercise of property, the exercise of the right and the ability to make something property. So this sort of linkage between the notion of freedom and property that Blackness then points to. So such coercion was necessary, was the necessity upholding liberty, the freedom expressed through the development of property. So separability engineered through property, that is, making property something that can be separated from any particular kind of organic relationships, bringing it under the act of coercion to be able to develop it. So separability engineered through property thus turns freedom into an abstraction rather than a lived experience. And it's a condition always threatened by the instabilities in maintaining bodies and terrain as something detached and individualized. That is in this notion of detaching from a sense of organicity. Property then is always in the process of being unsettled, even as it is in the process of being settled. So this notion of settlement, to settle, to develop, is always in some sense threatened by its own unsettled position. So property is thus a constriction of spaciousness, It's a reification of freedom in the terms of self-possession, something always wary of the possibilities of being possessed by other forces. So the rendering of the Black body as property, upheld as a matter of law, is the foundational move for permitting the indiscriminate use of violence against the Black body so as to physically enforce the space of capture. But once captured, once the legitimate recipient of violence, the maximization of the value of the captured, of the Black body, often meant reducing the semiopolitical trappings of capture so that the Black body might enact the full range of skills that it was capable of. So the whip could enforce the submission of the body to brute labor, but the whip was also an impediment to enabling the entrainment and exercise of advanced skills. That is, the development of the property that was possessed, the property. So whatever the genealogy, skilled Black labor was well demonstrated across intricate laboring, from stevedoring, pilotage, machine work, iron molders, and tool makers. So here, fungibility, that is the sense that property, the body as property, could be shaped and curated in any kind of way that didn't have to do with, that wasn't connected with a particular genealogy, was not only the availability of the Black body to beastly labor, to sexual expropriation and natal disconnection, but the capacity of Black skilled labor to express itself across different skills and professions within the body of a single Black worker. So historically, what was really interesting in Black individuals becoming skilled labor was the way in which they migrated and circulated across multiple different skills, rather than being sectorized into one particular skill. And so similarly, as Renaldo Walcott indicates, the looseness of differences across Black bodies, maintained by the intentional absenting of opportunities for individuation, facilitated a plurality of gathering among Black bodies in different to varied statuses and histories. So there's again this sense of a collective being that in some ways produces a disposition that is difficult to trace in terms of the composition of its parts. That is a kind of looseness of differences, a kind of fungibility of differences, which in some sense that fungibility is the predicate of developing the property of body, but at the same time that fungibility across bodies produces the possibility of a collective a collective that can do things that in some ways are unanticipated, unexpected, that are difficult to trace in terms of any kind of clear disposition. Urban governance and analysis is predominantly focused on what differences mean, what and how they signify. So an economy of differences without separability maintains the possibility of computation to introduce new improbabilities into the world. So once the Black body is revealed as featureless flesh by the violence imposed upon it, there is the danger for the capturer that this flesh will do something that cannot be grasped by any language or any form of control. Again, in some sense, to foreclose the possibility of a certain kind of individuation or clear specialization or clear direction of what the individual is supposed to be, but rather a kind of amorphous flesh on which is inscribed the violence of coercion to fungibly be whatever is needed to be. There is the danger that this flesh will do something that can't be grasped in any available terms of analysis. So here, a potentiality, brutal though it may be, emerges out of the most blatant disregard of one for another, a fundamental act of misrecognition, but which unleashes from the humanity denied another plane of extensionality, that is a flesh without definition, which saturates the field with the very questioning of distinction, in which challenges the presumption of the individual as a master of a life of their own. So when, as freedom is conceptualized as the ability to be in possession of the self as property, to possess property, to be able to develop property, to develop the self as property, turning the the way in which this notion is rooted in the conversion of certain humans as objects of property, reducing them to a sense of a kind of fungible, amorphous flesh. What that flesh is able to do, and what it has demonstrated its ability to do, is to extend itself into the world in forms of collectivity, which in the end questions that very presumption of the individual as a master of a life of their own as property. And this is in some ways then the paradox of freedom, the paradox of property, and then the paradox of the urban as the management of particular kinds of property. So Hortense Spillers, the renowned African-American theorist, finds a seemingly completely inappropriate term called empathy to address that impossible ground of mutuality, where everything and everyone is then dispossessed. Here, the very notion of urban relations and relationality assumes an irresolvable problematic. As spaciousness goes beyond being simply the articulation and reformatting of clearly distinguishable entities and positions, relations point to those moments where the traceability of differences disappears, even though relations are a matter of differences. So for example, in the daily life of Jakarta restlessness, residents often attribute their conditions to something that cannot be precisely named, simply referring to it as sesuatu, or something. That something is simultaneously a thing, but also a locus of the disappearance of things, a way of subjecting things to a relation where it is not clear exactly what a particular thingness contributes to the situation at hand. So while methods focused on, for example, intersectionality, which is so frequently and commonly used these days, may continue to be grounded upon a working out of the distinctive proportions of specifically demarcated dimensions we call race, gender, class, and so forth. Intersectionality is also a constitutive inoperability of these distinctions. It is also the basis of operations where these dimensions become something else altogether, where it's not just a matter of gender plus race plus class equals something that then is specific, but that in the intersection, that what takes place renders the distinctiveness of these particular forms that we call race or gender somehow inoperable, somehow just it disarms their salience, it disarms their distinctiveness. Ferreira da Silva then questions, on what basis do things necessarily relate? So certainly much of urban experience today demonstrates that the proximity of different ways of life in built environments does not guarantee that they will have anything to do with each other. I mean, one can just simply take the example of many extended urban regions and urban hinterlands that are full of all kinds of discrepant projects, discrepant spatial products, built environments that are right next to each other. But it's very difficult to discern any kind of relation amongst them. They just seem to be scattered across the landscape without any kind of coherence, without any kind of sequencing, without any kind of articulation. But in a world where relationality entails an ever prolific expansion of the ways in which things are at least potentially connected to each other. I mean, at the same time, you have this example of extended urban regions where nothing seems to be connected, but yet we know well that if we try to explain, to ask ourselves, why is it the way we feel what we feel, or what accounts for the position that I find myself in, it is difficult to put a period or a grammar or a boundary around what's relevant or what's not. The connections, the relations just ramify. So in a world where relationality entails an ever prolific expansion of the ways in which things are at least potentially connected to each other, aspirations to enhance our ability to tend to things, to be attentive to the operations of the cities we inhabit, would seem to be undermined by the sheer number of things we have to pay attention to. So if our capacity to alter our behaviors is motivated by paying attention to our surroundings and our actions in new ways, how then do we decide what's most relevant to pay attention to? What things are construed as most relevant to how we feel and act? And how do we draw the line at what kinds of events in our surrounds have something most immediately to do with us and our capacities to act? To what extent is relationality at the heart of an emerging sustainable economy of care? And to what extent is it the ruse of making everything fit or fixed, where every aspect of life is subsumed within an implicit calculus of mutual implication? And by that I mean we, you know, the kind, for example, within urban governance, this intense focus on notions of interoperability. You know, somehow, you know, we have a profile that's constituted by relating our school records to our credit ratings, to our family dynamics, to our geographies, to our, I mean, we emit now enormous amounts of data, and the key element becomes, even in terms of profitability, is how do you make those different data points relate to each other? So this kind of calculus of making everything fit, everything connect. Now, on the other hand, you know, the notion of the physics of locality, where locality is the ability of things to affect each other across vast distances, which upend our conventional notions of how things impact upon each other, that rework the spatialization of intimacy and cause and effect. How does that translate into workable apparatuses of administration and the provisions of basic needs? And this is sort of so evident within the sort of the intensified separations within the geographies of a single urban administration, where parts of the city have more to do with other parts thousands of miles away than they do with what's just across the street or across the tracks. So if what operates at a distance is more salient to the terms of my life than what I find right next to me, then what then do I do with my proximity to others? Clearly, as what is near moves further away and what is out there assumes a position of greater intimacy, there is room for all kinds of inversions not bound to linear conventions. But in this crossfire, relationality is something that spreads out almost virally rather than assumes any images of concentration. And then the apparent demise of political liberalism with its faux celebrations of diversity and tolerance of differences, as well as its implicit request that citizens take mind of each other's needs and realities, occurs in part because it instills a sense of incessant comparison, of diminishing entitlements and heightened anxiety that the self and place one occupies is permanently insufficient. And perhaps this is why, in my experience, that increasing numbers of residents of urban regions in the global South increasingly have little interest in seeing themselves as citizens or participating in conventional forms of social movements. So when we talk about difference without separability, this does not mean without detachment. Within that tricky space of relations where clearly differences are both being brought together and constituted, they are both inseparable and detached. But detached in the sense that it's not possible to conceive of a form of attachment that would subsume differences within some overarching formulation that coheres and coordinates whatever those differences are capable of doing. So in some ways, in contrast to the emphasis on the computable, on being able to make differences fit within particular kinds of algorithmic calculations. The question is, in terms of a detachment, is that differences that exist without any kind of ability to frame them within any kind of overarching coherent framework. So differences are not inseparable because they are unable to live with each other. It's not a relationship so much of codependency, but rather that they avail to each other the very material and conceptual resourcefulness that enables their difference, their very capacity to operate as a difference to the stabilization of any specific proposition or state of existence. Here, the paradox in Ferreira da Silva's terms then is that there is no difference that makes the difference. There is no ontologically separated blackness that makes whiteness what it is, allows it to enunciate itself as the epitome of something that blackness is not. Rather, that blackness coming into the world as a status and technology that had nothing intrinsic to do with the everyday life experiences of the people to be designated as Black, then comes to render them as a difference that buttresses the ability of white people to consolidate a set of privileged positions in relation to the earth in general, then comes to exceed anything anyone can say about it. This difference, so this difference, this sort of inseparable difference where you create a notion that has nothing to do intrinsically with the people to which you consign it to. And you're consigning it to these people, not because you're so much interested in these people themselves, but rather by default, to be able to define something that it is not. And then as a technology that is applied to that something that is not, then ends up with the status of being able to say anything that exceeds anything anyone can say about it, then is this paradox, and that this difference is inseparable from the very conditions that permitted enslavement and enduring anti-Blackness. So in some ways, the paradox is that you, in the interest of making something property and instituting property as the primary form of freedom, and freedom then the underlining of urban citizenship, that this maneuver ends up undermining the entire premise of the operation, because Blackness then, freed from the need to be anything specific, ends up positing the possibility of a kind of open-ended extended world which goes beyond the ability to make anything property, to make language property, to make a particular way of speaking the property of a particular self, to make citizenship a particular property of a particular kind of belonging, But this is this doubleness in some ways is inseparable from each other, which is why, in some sense, it becomes impossible to distinguish in some ways what is the captive and what is the non-captive, which is the kind of paradoxical position which I think underlines much of what we consider to be the sort of paradoxes inherent within the notion of the formal and informal. So the logics of comparison, contrast, dialectic, contradiction disappear into an elemental position of the incalculable. And that incalculable is thus the possibilities of spaciousness. So here there is also detachment from the game of trying to prove oneself as human, to try to prove oneself as being as good or worthy as anyone else. So regardless of the need to make a living, to put bread on the table, there is a substantive detachment from trying to anchor one's life in a specific place or territory. And circulation and movement become the practices of everyday inhabitation. And while residents may not move very far, it is this imperative to keep moving as a means of deflecting being the target of police, familiar judgments, restrictions, or obligations that affect a kind of detachment from a discernible relationship with a place or occupation. So this inseparable difference is particularly important in considering the complex entanglements of majority districts. The entanglements amongst household composition, entrepreneurial networks, financial reciprocities and dependencies, the profusion of tipping points, the multiplicity of risks and impulsive maneuvers, the intensive scrutiny of individual behavior, coupled with the indifference largely shown to individualized needs. If all of these constitute the kinds of contradictory, messed up elements of an urban majority, it constitutes a thick fabric, even a flesh that's difficult to alter and reweave. Here, residents are constantly doing something, but are increasingly unsure about what that something is, what it means, and what value it has. Yet, the repetition of entanglement provides the semblance of stability. It's not necessarily a precarious life. Even as residents want something different, they express confidence in what they have now, and their situation is largely felt as being all right. But it also constantly points to the limit of what it can be and turn into. The attainment of stability just this side of precarity then becomes both security and trap. But this both end, this inseparable relation of difference, is precisely the locus of its spaciousness and of its collective possibilities. So the capacity, I'll end with just the two last thoughts. So the capacity to live with its manifold expressions, impulses, and risks cannot be structured by a measured proportionality. That is, if only people were to adhere to specific mindsets and diets and behavioral regimens and investments, their prospects for longevity would be enhanced. Similarly, then, the terrain on which justice is to be done would entail removing the impediments that foreclose longevity to the oppressed and condemn them to a slow death. But the question that the American theorist Fred Moten raises is not so much whether that justice is indeed done through such an orientation, but rather, is justice itself inapplicable to apprehending the ways in which the eruption of such normative trajectories, the tumultuous spilling out of life in wayward, inexplicable ways, is both the product of subjugation and of life's priority, to use Foucault's notion, and that it is something impossible, and it is sometimes impossible to navigate this distinction. And this is increasingly, I think it will be increasingly more important as, particularly after pandemic conditions, where what's the state acts with the biopolitical imperative of taking care of life, of protecting life, of acting in the name of preserving life. But to what extent is that acting in the name of preserving life itself a limiting condition on life itself? Particularly when this claim to protect life is implemented in ways that simply maximize capital accumulation, to put it in its most banal sense. So in some ways, again, this inseparable difference, is the link between subjugation and life's priority. So the politics of inhabitation exceeds the restitutive and reparative logics of justice. It's something more spacious, as life's expressiveness, or more precisely, the modalities through which life is activated to resist notions of fulfillment, sustainability, and property. I mean, that's again, how close is our notion of sustainability to these sort of older notions of property, as in life being a series of properties to be cultivated so as to maximize its value or its prolongation. Here, politics is not directed toward either reversing dispossession or repossessing, but using the moment of dispossession to prefigure or predispose the available unbodying of the dispossessed to forms of gathering, sensing, and living that do not fully complete the process of resocialization in the terms imposed by the mobilizations of political rule, infrastructure accumulation, and territorial administration. For there seems to be an urban aesthetics that renders any overarching organizational logic inoperable. And while we may walk through the streets as we always have, we may be caught up in the same routines and expect the same results of these redundant actions. But these are always invested in and acted with a sense of always something beyond, but right here and now, through which the familiar could veer off into new directions. An eerie form of an aesthetic arithmetic that suggests that whatever appears in front of us is always less than and more than at the same time. And this in turn is life's priority. Thank you very much.
Okay. Thank you, Malik. And thank you so much for taking the framework of the paradox and making it so much more. We now have some time for some questions, which I will look up on the chat to see whether there's anyone no one has yet suggested that they want a question. It's going to be difficult to look. We have around about 77 people watching, and it's going to be hard for me to look for waving hands. So please just register on the chat if you have a question that you would like to put to Maliq Simone. While I'm waiting for the questions to come, I might start with a broad question. Maliq, as you're talking, we're looking at both the words and the images, and I'm thinking that that there is some kind of relation which is perhaps not directly logical, but I wonder, especially in the light of the phrase that you almost concluded there with the idea of a kind of aesthetic arithmetic. I wonder if you could talk about the relationship between the images in your talk and the content of the talk.
Yeah, I mean, I tried to posit, a kind of stereo in some way. I mean, a kind of another track that runs through the piece. So in some sense, the images are not illustrative of particular points, but try to open up a kind of different form of consideration with a certain kind of tension, a kind of reciprocity, a kind of tension that in some ways provokes the very question that you ask, what is it that these images have to, so in some sense, that's what I'm trying to do, because in some ways, if you're talking about a kind of aesthetics which is difficult to put into words, but which is operative, it's just some kind of attempt to think about what that might feel and look like. Basically, yeah.
Okay, we have a question from Mittal Vahanvati.
Hi, Kim. Would you like me to ask the question?
Yes, just read the question.
Okay, thanks, Abdul. I was wondering if you could please provide a real-life example to better understand the theory of body-land property in context of disasters and development.
Yeah, thanks for the question. I mean, I think that in some ways there's a lot of reference made to infrastructural failure in two senses. One, the failure that comes from the inadequacy of infrastructure to defer or to ameliorate disaster, the ways in which infrastructure becomes a tool to produce disaster. And I think, you know, particularly, for example, if you look at the work of the sort of environmental justice movements across different parts of the world, it's very evident the way in which infrastructure seems intentionally used to incapacitate particular kinds of inhabitants. And infrastructure failure, not as in some sense a kind of byproduct of the inadequacy of extending infrastructural capacity to particular populations, but the way in which infrastructure intentionally is instrumentalized to curtail, limit the particular kinds of collective capacities on the part of particular kinds of inhabitants, shaping what that inhabitation looks like and what it could be. So it's not simply it's not simply that particular populations are extracted from. It's not simply that their resourcefulness, their labor, their thinking, their history, their experience becomes an object of theft, which it often is. It becomes an object of theft. But yet that the very mechanism, the very technicities that are applied to shape and condition the terms of inhabitation itself are directly used to target those very kinds of capacities. And in this way, in some sense, disaster becomes productive, becomes instrumentalized as a way in which to curtail forms of self-possession, forms of collective possession. I mean, and I think this will become, you know, increasingly an important kind of consideration as cities become more and more a locus of the expression of particular kinds of disasters, which then have to be responded to resiliently, and where resilience in some ways both valorizes the capacities of those that have often not been valued because of, now we value them because of their resilience and use that resilience as a kind of model in which to live through disasters. But at the same time, the ways in which those same disasters are repurposed to limit the very conditions through which that supposed resilience took place.
Okay, thank you. Helene Frischot.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for a truly phenomenal lecture, and also in many ways a sort of conceptually poetic lecture. And I'm still struggling with the various relations you've brought to bear on the series of concepts, but I'm interested if I can kind of put it together in a series of steps. I think that the paradox of property is primarily that it is in the first instance meant to be the means of securing freedom, but in fact becomes the instrument of the worst kind of oppression, especially with respect to histories of slavery and or the colonial lives of property, as Breda Bandar might put it. And so amidst all of this, I'm looking in your lecture for these moments of perhaps resistance or escape, which seem to demand a sort of detachment from place or a kind of wandering, or kind of poetics of relation, which makes me think of Edouard Glissant. And then the risks of a nomadic peripatetics, perhaps. But in the end, I'm really curious if you can, in the midst of this, expand a bit more on notions of this spaciousness, life's priority in a spaciousness. There's a difference that refuses to be reconciled. So I've got the kind of spaciousness that seems as a mode of resistance of life's very expressiveness. And in its kind of differentiation, it's a refusal to kind of secure a value in difference per se. I'm trying to kind of like get my head around all of this.
So how do you want me to?
Yeah, maybe spaciousness, because there's such, it seems, so I'm looking for the moments of escape, for a sensation of being oppressed based on, you know, the oppressions of property, which seem to demand reneging property and wandering around and not claiming place, which is described through the terms you use, such as spaciousness or the expressiveness of life. And I'm looking for how these can become modes of resistance, and maybe again through an example. I don't know. Yeah.
Yeah, I'm not sure. You see, I'm not sure to what extent it can be easily translated into ways of resisting. I think more there's a kind of unsettling and undermining, a tremulousness, tumultuousness that's introduced into the world by a particular kind of capacity to turn the terms of capacity, to turn the terms of being in some ways reduced to a sense of amorphous flesh, into a sense of extensivity that in some ways undermines the consolidation of property as the only means of freedom's expressiveness. I mean, in some sense, this is what Hortense Spillers is trying in some ways to get at in this notion of empathy. That is, for those that were captured, that were held captive, what was it that they could do? So they could enact and enunciate a kind of relationship with the world in which they attempted to instrumentalize the very conditions of their denial in another way that in some sense did not have the vernacular or the language in which to institutionalize itself, but yet was in some sense expressive of this ability to operate in and through extensionalities with the world. So it's very difficult to see this as a kind of resistance. It is a kind of unsettling process. I mean, it's not that I don't think that resistance is not possible. There are modes of resistance. There are ways in which people simply obdurately hang on and refuse to move. And there are others which are constantly on the move, so that they can't be pinned down, they can't be apprehended, they can't be framed. So these are two different modes of resistance. But what I guess I'm trying to point to is, in some ways, not the fact that what we consider to be grounded in some ways really is fundamentally unsettled. And how do we, in some ways, think through, assume that kind of unsettling as not a byproduct, but as a kind of default position, and then start to read things from there. And that's why, in some sense, I'm committed to the ways in which Black studies helps us to think through the urban in different ways. It is this kind of lens which I'm trying to apply to formations of collective life that in some ways don't adhere to the kinds of mobilizations that we usually associate with politics. Are there ways in which people operate in concert without intentionally attempting to operate in concert, but simply in some ways, given their captive positions, however that capture is defined and experienced, find ways to extend themselves across different kinds of terrain and relations, which in some ways produce something else that's not easily framed or defined. Just in the way in which the way in which all algorithmic calculations themselves produce a surfeit of the incalculable. There's something that's a byproduct, that's incomputable, that can't be picked apart, that can't be defined in clear ways. And it's not resistance to the computation. The computation process continues to go on and unfold, but there's a spaciousness to it that is, in some sense, unsettled, undefined. And I think Blackness enables us to think through a kind of history of this, and not to deny that within those Black histories that there hasn't been resistance, that there hasn't been rebellion, that there's been all of these things. Yeah.
Let's see if we can get through a couple more questions. Anoma Pieris has a question.
Hi, Malik. Thank you for a really stimulating talk, and really appreciate your putting the text there, because it seemed necessary to read it to follow your ideas, because they're quite complex. I began to think about a project that I am working in the terms that you were setting out. And I'm interested in the way that labor is instrumentalized in a settler colonial context in relation to liberty and property. And looking at the case of Australia, wondering whether in a place where the relationship to territory is so constructed by settlers, to understand really what role does labor play. And I was interested in, I've been studying two types of conditions. One was the concentration of enemy aliens during World War II, in which case they were removed from their properties and made to do manual labor. And that was the way their bodies were manipulated and punished, through removal and incarceration. And the second, through the indenture of refugee migrants in the post-war period, where they had 2 years of indenture before entering society and being able to engage in owning property. So this idea that the labor suspends the opportunity and the liberties that come with property. So these two conditions in which property is kind of removed or suspended and then replaced by labor, by a kind of forced labor. And what I was trying to gauge as you were talking is whether the settler colonial context actually heightens or exaggerates some of these relations or brings them into stark relief. So here you're looking at indenture rather than slavery, for instance, in this example. Thank you.
No, I think that's a really that's a really important project and a really important point. I mean, and it raises the question as to what really is labor. What is labor today? What is the scope of labor? And so that in some sense that those that, I mean, we know that within all of the urban areas in which we work, that the extensiveness of dispossession grows. People dispossessed from the ability to be in place, you know, whether or not they own the property or not, but to have a sense of emplacement. So people that are set loose, dispossessed, what is it that they do, and what someone like Neferti Tadiar would argue that what it is that they do becomes an important kind of mode of labor by virtue of being unsettled. That can be hedged, that can be formulated into a kind of derivative. And indeed, you know, if one looks at the afterlives of dispossession across many cities, where entire neighborhoods are uprooted, unsettled, what happens? Where do people go? What do people do? And what often happens is that the dispersal of related people, the dispersal of collaborative relationships that spreads out is re-pieced together across a distance. So you have these sort of fragmented, extensive networks of dispossessed individuals. And what Tadiar will argue is that becomes a form of labor, that becomes a form of work, of being able to uncover particular kinds of articulations across the territory that posit a model of potential resettling in the future. So if our notions of being settled and being territorialized assume a particular kind of form, particular kind of static form, a kind of geometric form that perhaps is not adequate to the anticipation of the future, whose labor explores the new kinds of territorializations that might be possible. So dispossession is not simply to land grab and to take and to maximize the value of that piece of territory from which people are dispossessed, but that dispossession becomes instrumentalized itself by converting those bodies into a form of labor that explores different kinds of dispersed articulations across the city that become themselves a prefiguration of new kinds of possibilities. So the notion of settlement, of what it means to be a settler, is also in the process of being altered and altered through appropriating the bodies of the dispossessed to suggest and prefigure new ways of thinking about these things.
Thank you.
Okay, look, unfortunately, we are now out of time. There are a few extra questions that I would love to hang around and and explore. But I really think that we need to call this to a close, and to thank AbdouMaliq Simone so much for your wonderful presentation, and obviously so engaging with so many of our audience. If any of you want to hang around a little bit and chat a little bit more, I'll keep the Zoom open. But I just want to, knowing that many of you will now disappear, say thank you very much to Malik. Thank you very much to all of our audience for coming along, and for all of the questions. This is, as I said, a part of a series of 4 seminars, roughly framed in a similar way. We have the architect Alfredo Brillenborg next in about a month, then followed by Colin McFarland about a month later, and Fran Tonkus a month later after that. So you can find the details on our website at infur.org. But for now, I think I need to say thank you very much to AbdouMaliq Simone and to all of you for coming along today. Virtual claps all around.
Thanks to Hub. Thank you for the Hub. Thank you. Oh, hi. How are you doing, Amanda?
Apa kabar? Baik, Pak Malik. Where are you at the moment? In Berlin?
No, I'm in London. I live in London.
Okay.
Yeah. And you? Are you in Melbourne? Where are you?
I'm in Melbourne.
Okay.
I'm in Melbourne, but virtually I'm in Bandung, somewhere in the market, in the pasar.
Yeah. It seems that way. Yeah. Are you staying okay? Have things been all right for your family and everything? Is it okay?
Yeah, it's a bit anxious. Well, it's scary. But luckily, mother and my sister, they all been vaccinated. But literally at home, not going anywhere. So thank you for asking. Can we ask questions now, Kim?
Look,
Can we still ask questions?
If Malik is willing to hang around and answer a few more questions, then I'm happy to do that. Inji John and Thea Van Grunen have both been hanging around as well, and a couple of others. Inji, do you want to butt in with your question?
Yes.
It's possible Malik doesn't know you. Can you?
I do.
Refocus your camera so we can see you.
I know Inji, yeah.
Oh, yeah, right. Okay.
Hello, Professor Simone. My question is kind of insignificant. I just wanted to ask you about the question that you raised about what kinds of relations are more worthy of exploring more than others in order to pay attention to the surroundings that are not only just immediately tactile, but also implicated, kind of hidden, but implicated in our ways of, living. So I don't know, how do you define which storylines are more worthy of telling, or, yeah, I don't know. It's kind of a methodological question. I don't know.
Yeah, I don't know. It's like too early in the morning to make a decision about these kinds of things. But it's more of a question, Inji, than anything else. I mean, it's sort of like a not a trick question, but it is a question that one could possibly, not pragmatically, but possibly respond to with a sense of indifference, that it doesn't matter, that you pick anything, that you start with anything that's available. And it is something that, one sometimes finds this kind of an attitude for some who simply are either besieged by too many or not enough, but it does require the thing is, it requires a decision. And on what basis is that decision made? And it's a decision that in some ways becomes more and more arbitrary as it becomes impossible to wade through the. No, this is what underlines the obsession with proportionality, in terms of sort of like our urban governance systems, how much of it is local transportation, how much of it is finance, how much of it is sort of flood mitigation, how much of, trying to find a proportionality within the sort of overall urban realm of which to focus on, to spend money on, to emphasize, and so a lot of money and time is spent on sort of systems of calculation that try to work out those proportions, which I think in the end, in some ways, could be as arbitrarily decided as anything else,
How about you as a storyteller?
As a storyteller?
How about you? Yeah.
Oh. Well, I mean, sort of in a very boring way, which is to think through the exceptions, the minoritarian positions, in a kind of Deleuzian sense of, the sort of the minority, those without a kind of overarching story. But that's not something that's so interesting, but yeah.
Thank you.
Okay.
Sorry,
if
I think I was before you.
Okay, go ahead. Sorry.
Go ahead, Fia. It's clearly we've moved into the highly informal part of the presentation. So go ahead, Fia.
Sorry, I'm absolutely thrilled to be able to ask Maliq a question. I feel very privileged. I'm a big fan. Thank you for your presentation. My question is, at one point you said that moving through the city, we do notice others and we see their experience. And even though we want to be attentive to it, and we have aspirations to be attentive, there's so much going on that we are unable to be attentive. Perhaps you can just touch a bit on what those things are that are keeping us from being attentive.
Yeah, it's a wonderful question.
I'm here in Namibia, where we're
okay.
also under the South African apartheid administration. So we actually do have very, very clear divides between races and spatially as well. And I'm very interested to know that, or to hear what it is that keeps people from really registering these differences. And I know we shouldn't say empathy, but yeah, what is it?
I mean, we could sort of turn it around and to say, well, what happens when people are very attentive? I mean, like I remember from the time I lived in Johannesburg, and you go down Bree Street. I mean, there are groups of people that pay attention to absolutely everything. I mean, they notice right away the brand of shoes you're wearing, the way you're walking, the way you're dressed, how you're, I mean, there is a way in which, you get to know people who work the street and you ask them what goes on that street, and they, in voluminous detail can render the events and the scenes with just unbelievable detail. So they're paying attention. Now, what do they do with what do they do with all of that? Well, they'll tell you that they they're not so much concerned with establishing a position, but rather they move with the flow of the events of Bree Street. Now, some of them go with the flow in order to identify things that can be stolen or ripped off, or things that they can insert themselves into. That is, everything becomes available to a kind, to being in some ways interrupted, to being in some ways destabilized, to being intervened in, to being in some sense engaged with. So the byproduct for those that are always paying attention is that kind of movement, the zigzag, the shifting gears, the ability to quickly change course. You don't stay in place. So if in some ways that is in some sense the byproduct of a kind of hyper-attentiveness, then to not pay attention or to be less attentive might be in some ways the predicate for trying to consolidate a position, to consolidate a sense of place, to staying still, to staying stable, to staying maybe. So maybe in some ways it is, you know, you have to think about it as the implications of a certain kind of attentiveness. I mean, to be an object of attention also is not so, you know, I mean, because, you know, what happens when all eyes are on you, you know, when all eyes are on you, you tend to try to present a kind of image of yourself which deflects the gaze, you know, which attempts not to, you know, I mean, if you look at the sort of colonial situations, how did the Black cities of the world cities maintain some kind of autonomy? Well, they did it by, in some sense, performing a certain kind of compliance, so that the people that when the authorities would look at those districts, they'd say, oh, everything's okay there. We don't need to pay that much attention anymore. We'll let it be. So, you know, attentiveness has its doubled connotations. You know, on the one hand, the capacity to move, but also to be the object of attention, in some ways means that your mobility is in some ways limited.
I think my question, yeah,
Mandy, we'll have to make this the last one, okay?
Yeah, okay. I think this relates to my questions, what we just discussed now, this notion of sesuatu, of something, in the way Jakarta's residents find it very difficult to make sense of their urban conditions. And I'm wondering if that struggle to explain what they are is something that is helping their cause, in the sense that they are not easily defined or contained or classified, or does it make them vulnerable in a way that they're so illegible? And if I speak with the middle class colleague of mine in Jakarta, they really literally cannot see the space outside their office, their house. It's because it's so complex, it's so illegible. And would it make it so much easier for those complex urban conditions to be demolished, you know, and replaced by the urban spectacle?
No, I mean, this is why the entanglement of legibility with the illegible, you know. I mean, legibility in some ways works itself off from a kind of field of illegibility. And as it works itself off, becomes dependent upon it, but it has to deny that kind of dependence in order to sustain itself, you know. Just as in some ways, you know, whiteness can't exist on its own. It has no condition of its own, but it has to depend on that of which it's not, but it can't. So that kind of simultaneous expendability and dependence is always in a kind of dynamic tension, and it can go either way. It either is the kind of condition for an ongoing endurance of the kampung, or it makes it vulnerable, always vulnerable to its elimination.
Yeah.
And in some ways, there's no easy way out of that kind of tense entanglement. This is why sort of this inseparability is a tricky terrain. It's not a terrain of liberation. It is a always tricky terrain that has to, in some sense, be worked through. Particularly now under, I mean, if you continuously look at and Mia, who's maybe still around, she has a much better handle on this than I do. But if you constantly look at the data around, airway, airtay, incidence of COVID incident rates, it's a kind of mystery in some way. I mean, there are clear examples, obviously Petamanggan Timor is a high incident rate, and one can kind of understand that. But it is also one of the places in Jakarta that's most expendable in some ways, most obdurate and expendable, because people continuously have come back, refused eviction, been evicted, come back. It's obdurate, it holds on, it endures, but yet it is vulnerable to, and if you look at Penjaringan in a way too, a very different area, high incident rates, very different kinds of complexion. But then look at places like Galore and Kampung Rawa, Tangatinggi, the rates of infection are not that high, So it's similar compositions, similar illegibilities, but with different kinds of trajectories of endurance, of being paid attention to, left alone. And I just don't think you can understand these things without situating them within this kind of complex entanglement of, yeah. But you're right. I mean, the illegibility is a vulnerable position to be in by virtue of the way in which decisions are made about who's expendable, what life is value or not, what ways of doing things are valuable or not.
Thank you, AbdouMaliq.
Malik, thank you so much for staying around a little bit longer and engaging. I'm sure everyone appreciates it. It's great to see so many good friends of the Hub from so many parts of the world join us together here on Zoom. And great to be able to engage in this way. So thank you all very much again. And thank you for getting up so early in London. Time to go and have some breakfast and recover. Okay. So
okay, thanks Kim, and thanks to all friends out there, friends, colleagues. It's wonderful to see you, and thanks for all of your support and friendship.
Okay. Yeah.
Thank you, AbdouMaliq.
Good. We look forward to catching up again when we're able to visit each other some more.
Okay. Yeah.
Okay.
Bye.
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 Bye.